Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Hi, everyone. We'd like to get started. Hi, welcome. Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm so happy that you could all be here, and we're really excited to have this policy seminar today and share some of our research from Ethiopia. Thanks very much to everyone for joining and for everyone that helped us prepare for this event. So just briefly, I want to kind of acknowledge some of my colleagues. Alamayo Sam Tefese, he leads IFPRI's Ethiopia office and kindly joined us today and will give some opening remarks. The study team includes myself, Jessica Light, Harold Alderman, Melissa Drobo, Michael Mulford, with substantial help from Helena Tambet and Parthu Kalva on analysis. And so we will go through this is our agenda here. After some opening remarks from Alamayu, I'll briefly introduce the study design, and then we have research for you from 4 components of the program, 4 sets of outcomes. We'll go through those presentations, and then we have a panel discussion. Dean Carlin and Margot Vinez are here, and I'll introduce them later. And then following that, we'll have time for kind of open discussion and Q&A. Okay, thanks very much. With that, I'll ask Alamayu to come up.
Thanks, Dan. So I start by greeting all attending in person as well as remotely. So my task here is to briefly introduce the PSNP to set the scene for what follows in terms of the study results. I'm sure by now everybody knows what the PSNP is. It is the Productive Safety Net Program that started in 2005 in Ethiopia. Its primary objective is to smooth consumption or protect assets by using transfers in chronically food insecure communities. It has 2 parts, public works and direct support, with the ratio of 80-20 roughly, in favor of public works. Through public works, it builds community assets, focusing in particular on soil and water conservation structures, irrigations, roads, schools, and clinics, and so on. One of the unique features. Oh, nobody heard what I said? It's tempting to go back, but no. So it's one of its unique features is the fact that it's a long-term program. It has been around for a while, and it's designed to be initially a 5-year program, and is financed by multiple donors and the government of Ethiopia, with the implied need for significant coordination. It's large in terms of coverage, about 8 million beneficiaries, and in terms of resources, about $500 million every year, although it is smaller in more recent years. Related to what we are going to listen to today, in recent years, it has also piloted what it is called the Livelihood Transfer Program since 2018, a program designed to mimic some of the key features of the graduation models. And another interesting fact is that it has been subject to IFPRI-led independent process and impact evaluations since its beginning, and that is, I think, pretty unique, particularly in development programs in Ethiopia. So what does the evidence say? The evidence said that the PSNP worked reasonably well overall, and obviously its performance can be improved with appropriate redesign and more effective implementation. But to highlight some findings, PSNP improved food security, has a mixed impact on asset protection and accumulation. In some instances, better improvement, in others, no impact. And it led also to some nutrition improvements, particularly at the household level, although child nutrition was not impacted by the program. And interestingly, it has produced economy-wide multiplier effects and may have improved resilience, although the evidence is still accumulating. But all these good outcomes are subject to two core sets of concerns voiced about the PSNP. The first is dissatisfaction with program effectiveness due to lack of graduation, targeting problems in some geographic areas of its operations, timeliness of transfers, particularly in more recent years, and a widely perceived or alleged dependency of beneficiaries or disincentive effects. The first three challenges have been ascertained by IFPRI evaluations. On the other hand, evidence of significant disincentive effects are yet to be uncovered. We tried to do so, but we haven't found yet. The second problem, or the second concern, is unease about PSNP sustainability. The program budget tightened substantially in recent years due to increasing role of a fiscally constrained government, apparent donor fatigue, and a growing demand. As a consequence, extensive conversations are going on regarding the way forward for the PSNP. The seminar is thus an opportune moment to contribute to that conversation. More broadly, of course, it contributes to the knowledge about graduation programs, exploring the findings from the RCT in question. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Alamay. I appreciate it. That's a wonderful introduction and overview to the PSNP. So I want to begin just acknowledging USAID funding. USAID is the key funder for the program and also for this research, Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs. The program is delivered by World Vision, together working with CARE and the local NGO called ORDA. Okay, so with that, I'll get into kind of an overview of our trial design, and I want to start with a bit of motivation. We know that in recent years, a growing literature in development economics has examined overlapping constraints faced by households in extreme poverty. These constraints are very salient, and given that, that's given birth to this multifaceted graduation model of interventions. And we've seen that they simultaneously address several barriers in a sort of big push model. That's what sort of kicked this off, was the desire for a big push to achieve more sustainable poverty reduction and improvements in well-being. We now have several examples of several large-scale programs like this, and some significant evidence on that showing that these models can be extremely effective. Today, we're going to present evidence on new evidence on our randomized trial of this graduation model program in Ethiopia. We call it SPIR. It's Strengthen PSNP Institutions and Resilience. And the program targets beneficiaries of the Productive Safety Net program. So all of the beneficiaries in our study belong to the PSNP, and thus they're among the poorest 20% of rural households in Ethiopia. In addition to enhancing livelihoods, SPIR also focuses on challenges in the domains of nutrition, gender equity, and psychosocial well-being. That's some of the novelty of what we find in terms of programming, and we think that's going to come through as we present the evidence today. So we contribute to the literature by evaluating this nutrition-sensitive graduation model. The nutrition component being added is relatively new, and also one that is implemented at scale, which is relatively uncommon in this literature so far. And then we'll be unpacking the evidence around effectiveness for different intervention bundles. I won't take too much time on the introduction of the PSNP. Alamay has covered that well for us, but it is among the largest social safety net programs in Africa. Our study was conducted during the fourth phase of the PSNP, so from 2016 to 2021. As Alamayu mentioned, households who are in the PSNP already get cash transfers in the form of, food or cash transfers totaling about $277 a year. And Alamayu's nicely covered the past evidence from IFPRI and other work. So I'll just get right into describing the components of the SPIR intervention. So first, the SPIR project helped deliver, that worked with local governments in Amhara and Oromia regions to help deliver the PSNP transfers, and then built up this multifaceted program centered around 6 interventions. And these come across from livelihoods, health, and nutrition. So we have village-level savings groups, training in agricultural and livelihood value chains, lump sum transfers, which are delivered either as a poultry kit or cash. There is nutrition behavior change counseling, and we have 2 models there, a more basic one and an enhanced or intensive one that I'll describe. male engagement groups, and then interpersonal group therapy. So all of these, again, are targeted only to PSNP households. And due to scale and resource constraints, the transfers in interpersonal therapy are further targeted to PSNP beneficiaries within the study model. So we take these 6 interventions and group them into either lighter touch or more intensive models together in a livelihood component or a nutrition component. And so here's how that works. On the livelihood side, we have what we call the L intervention is the light touch one. It includes the savings groups and trainings that I just mentioned. L-STAR is the more intensive model. We add to the savings groups and training the lump sum transfers. So these are valued at about $375, and we actually randomize 2 transfer modalities that's delivered either as cash or as a poultry kit. And that randomization is at the cluster level within those intervention treatment arms that are getting the L-STAR treatment. Within those clusters, we only give the lump sum transfers to the poorest 55% of households in those clusters. And this is driven primarily by resource constraints of the program. They couldn't reach all households in those communities. And so at the baseline, we constructed an asset index and identified essentially an extremely poor strata and a less poor strata. And that's an important sort of dimension of our design, which I'll show you in a moment. But the L-STAR intensive lump sum transfers go only to the extremely poor. On the nutrition side, for nutrition and health, we have a basic model. The N model gives basic behavior change counseling only, and the N-STAR model adds a more intensive BCC model, male engagement, and group therapy. Again, the group therapy is based on a screening of women at midline in our midline survey, and those are the only women who receive that. So the N-STAR intervention, if you're not in that depression group, is the BCC model and male engagement. Okay, so we now combine these packages, L, L-STAR, N, and N-STAR, to build our treatment arms. So we have a 4 treatment arm design, and this design is essentially like a modified crossover design. So within this, we have 2 of the treatment arms are getting N-STAR, the more intensive nutrition component. 2 of the treatment arms are getting L-STAR, that's the more intensive one that includes the lump sum transfers. You can see how our sample is distributed. We have 192 cabelles or subdistricts, 3,314 households, and this is how they're distributed across the treatment arms. And then again, so among the clusters, there's nearly 50 clusters in each treatment arm. So then within those, we identify in every cluster the 55% of households that are extremely poor in our sample, those that are less poor, and then you can see in the L-STAR interventions in T1 and T2, then they get access to lump sum transfers. So T1 is the most intensive version of our model. It has the intensive livelihood and nutrition component. T2 has intensive livelihoods and essentially basic nutrition. T3 has basic livelihoods and the intensive nutrition. And our control group are PSNP households only. They don't receive any aspect of SPIR. So we're essentially comparing 3 different graduation models. We took the kind of multifaceted approach seriously, obviously, but we did this to try to look at dimensions of complementarity of the different models. In terms of our surveys, we have 3 rounds of data collection, a baseline in 2018, a midline in 2019, and the end line was in 2021. I've mentioned the sample structure. In terms of eligibility, all households are PSNP beneficiary households. They have to have a child under age 3, and the primary caretaker of that child has to be a household member. We had modest attrition, 3% at midline, 7% at end line. The spike, the little spike there is due primarily to loss to follow-up of a few clusters due to inaccessibility due to conflict. This is a timeline of the rollout of the interventions as they relate to the timing of our data collection. So you can see here all are getting PSNP. Just after baseline, the basic livelihood intervention is rolled out, as well as the basic and intensive nutrition interventions. Before midline, poultry and cash transfers are distributed, and then just after midline is when the male engagement groups and group therapy are started. This rollout is due in part to kind of designing the need to design these interventions and also fund them. Okay, so we're going to draw on this design to present effects of SPIR on 4 main families of outcomes. These are the 4 presentations coming up. We'll start with livelihoods, and then nutrition, gender equity, and then mental health. I'm just going to take another moment to sort of describe the analytical models that we use so that you have a sense of sort of how the sample kind of works out into these presentations in our analysis. So I'm going to reinforce that 2 of our interventions were targeted to subsamples. Again, the lump sum transfers in the communities that are receiving those, in T1 and T2, are targeted only to the extremely poor households. And the therapy model is based on a screening of depression that was conducted at midline. So only women that were found to be depressed at midline are invited to participate in group therapy. So where we seek to estimate effects of the transfers, then we do separate specifications only for the extreme poor sample, and the less poor sample would not be included there. For mental health outcomes, treatment effects will be presented only for women screened for depression in our presentation here. In the paper, we have a sort of model. We test this also for the entire analysis sample. So this is just what this looks like. So in the livelihoods and nutrition presentations, for example, you'll see analysis done only in the extreme poor sample. And so we just retain those portions of the sample in all 4 treatment arms. This gives us full heterogeneity across each trial arm in the assignment to transfer on the livelihood side and a cross-cutting heterogeneity in nutrition exposure. And then when we do analysis only on the less poor sample, this is what we see. So there's no heterogeneity here in terms of livelihoods programming for the less poor. And the only variation we see in programming is between N and N star. And finally, for the depression analysis and mental health, we have a smaller sample, as I mentioned, of women screened for depression, and we do analysis both at the full sample level, the extreme poor and the less poor. Finally, I just want to briefly give an overview of the sample characteristics. So these households are all rural subsistence producers. More than 75% of household heads have no education, and around 20% of the households are female-headed. These are poor households, so consumption per capita is around $1.30 per day at baseline. And then I just wanted to kind of emphasize the fragility of this context and the large number of shocks that were experienced during the study period and certainly subsequently. So around a third of households experienced mild to moderate drought during the study. Infestations of desert locusts had significant effects in 1 out of 3 households in Oromia. And there is sporadic violence that occurs during the study in Amhara and Oromia, kind of spiking a little bit as we were wrapping up at the end line. Our end line took place just 3 months after the start of the Tigray War. Okay, thank you very much. And I'll invite Jessica to come up.
Great, thanks. I'll be presenting evidence on the effects of this light touch graduation model, enhancing livelihoods outcomes. So as Dan summarized, we know that previous papers have shown large effects of these types of multifaceted interventions in reducing poverty. Again, some notable differences. This model includes a somewhat smaller transfer, though the transfer size in literature varies. It was $200 at the prevailing exchange rate, or $375 in PPP terms, and somewhat leaner support services. More limited training. There's no household-level coaching in this model, and there's no experimental variation in consumption support, since all arms, including the control arm, are receiving the PSNP. And we're interested in assessing whether the same positive effects on livelihoods can be replicated here. I will report effects for the extremely poor and less poor samples separately, given that only extremely poor are eligible for transfers, and focus on 5 primary outcome families: assets, financial inclusion, savings and credit access, income from agriculture and livestock, non-agricultural income, and consumption. I'll only show end-line findings here. The paper has both midline and end-line findings, and I'll briefly touch on this. Again, just to remind you, for extremely poor, we'll be presenting coefficients for poultry and cash recipients, also interacted with the cost-cutting exposure to N star, and then the no transfer group, or the L-only group. For the less poor, we have a much simpler model, since it's savings groups and training, no transfer in all 3 arms, and cross-cutting variation in nutrition. So here's the first graph summarizing the experimental effects, again, that we see at N9. The 5 outcome families are on the left: assets, financial inclusion, agricultural income, non-agricultural income, and consumption. So the first observation is that the positive effects are generally restricted to transfer recipients. So for the non-transfer recipients, the no transfer group, we see little evidence of any positive effects other than a large effect on financial inclusion, an increase of about 0.2 standard deviations. For the transfer recipients, there's a weak positive effect on assets. So at an end line, it's about 1.1 standard deviations relative to the control arm, marginally significant in some subarms. The effects on financial inclusion are large and consistent, but between 0.3 and 0.4 standard deviations. There's some positive effects on agricultural income. You can see particularly for those in the N-only arm, it's about a 0.1 to 0.2 standard deviation effect on agricultural income. There's no effect on non-agricultural income. These households show very, very low levels of engagement in any type of non-agricultural activity. The rate of reporting any non-agricultural activity is about 5%. That's consistent in all rounds and in all treatment arms. And finally, consumption. At the bottom, you can see here the treatment effects are quite tightly clustered around 0. The standard errors generally allow us to rule out an effect larger than about 0.1 to 0.15 standard deviations. So we can say with some confidence that we are not observing even a moderate size effect on consumption. The only other point I'll note, again, this is at end line. If we compare midline to end line, the financial inclusion effects are quite consistent. The assets effects are clearly decaying over time. So these households saw a larger increase in assets at midline that was shortly after they had received transfers, but those asset stocks aren't growing, they're actually shrinking, presumably because households are drawing down those asset stocks for other reasons. Then for the less poor, you can see, again, a much simpler picture. We don't see any effects on the less poor. None of these households receive transfers, other than, again, the large effect on financial inclusion that's quite consistent. The other point I can note across both graphs, in general, we see that for those exposed to N-STAR, the intensive nutrition programming, the effects on livelihoods outcomes are moderately smaller. Now, in general, those interactions are not significant, so we don't want to overemphasize it, but it does seem that the effects on livelihoods outcomes were larger in the absence of intensive nutrition programming. I want to now just briefly touch on another dimension of this analysis. As Dan alluded to, this sample was exposed to a wide range of shocks in this period, including droughts. So about a third of our sample experienced a mild to moderate drought in our study period. This is not an acute drought over a 10 or 15-year time period. But we identify these moderate droughts using the SPIR drought measure, exploiting variation across survey rounds and localities and exposure to drought to assess whether SPIR had a protective effect for households particularly exposed to these shocks. I'm now going to simplify further to a single pool treatment effect, SPIR versus control, and show two simple measures, livestock holdings and the food gap, which is a measure of food security. So the way we interpret these results is as follows. You can see in the first line for the control households, the effect of an average drought in this period, which was 0.25 standard deviations on the SPIR scale for control households, was to worsen the food gap, meaning more food insecurity, and to degrade the asset stock, so less livestock. And actually those effects are of roughly similar magnitude. The control households had a 1/3 increase in their food gap if exposed to a drought, and a 1/3 decline in their asset. These are interpretable as percentages. For treatment households, for those exposed to SPIR, though, we see those effects are significantly attenuated towards 0. So treatment households had about a 15 percentage point increase in their food gap, marginally significant, and they had about a 10 percentage point decline in their asset stock. So they are not fully buffered from the adverse effects of drought, but the effects are significantly smaller. So just to sum up, we see evidence that SPIR had some effects on asset stocks and particularly financial inclusion, also on generating income from livestock, but overall no evidence that it had substantial or transformative effects. That being said, households exposed to SPIR do show evidence of reduced adverse effects of drought for this roughly a third of sample households. So this pattern is consistent with the positive but generally small treatment effects we see in the full sample, in that the largest benefits seem to be concentrated in this smaller minority exposed to adverse shocks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As Alamala pointed out, oops, got the wrong way. Okay. As Alamala pointed out, the safety net program was started to do consumption smoothing. It was a food security project. It was not a nutrition project. 10 years after it started, did they include nutrition in the program. Now, during the initial period, there were tests, evaluations of nutrition, and they showed no impact on nutrition. But this fits very much with the global experience, with cash transfers in general or in-kind transfers, where recent meta-analysis showed a 1.5% increase, not percentage point, in stunting globally. So that safety nets by themselves have a modest, surprisingly modest impact on nutrition and stunting outcomes. There also are a set of studies globally in looking at graduation programs, as we've just discussed. These programs have not, in general, tested whether or not the programs affect nutrition. There are very few in the literature that include nutrition. They include maybe diet and food security, but not nutrition outcomes. So that this project then adds to the literature on testing both the graduation and overlay of graduation, and on trying to intensify the services that are provided in conjunction with the transfer. Those type of services, every household in the safety net program receives a certain core set of services. That is part of the fourth phase of the safety net program. In addition, there are some water and sanitation programs which are being spread out. In the L-STAR communities, the ones that we were just talking about, the enhanced livelihood, there are transfer programs. There are graduation additional transfers. Those have been overlaid in some of the program with nutrition programs. In addition, we have an enhanced nutrition program which provides additional services even further than the core nutrition program. So there's three steps. There are those that the core group gets, everybody in the safety net program gets. There are those nutrition services which are given to what we call the core nutrition program, the T2 program. And then there's enhanced programs which are done in the T1 and T3 programs, which include both something called time and targeted counseling, where there should be 11 visits over the 1,000 days from conception to the child's 2 years birthdays. Plus, if a child is screened to be malnourished, they are invited to participate in a 2-week program for child feeding sessions. So that program is far more intensive than the core nutrition program. And again, as showed in the design, this has been overlaid with cash transfers to allow to look at the complementarities. So just as to summarize this, what we see, the bottom line is the enhanced nutrition with grants, with livelihood grants. Now, at baseline, they were slightly, but not statistically significant, lower stunting rates there over the entire program. Clearly, that they have done better in a relative sense, but the entire community had declining nutritional status, so that this can be looked upon to some degree as a significant impact in a protective manner. To look upon this, the same thing, this is showing the test. Now, I should point out that the original sample, the baseline sample, every household had a child under 3 years old. Now, we came back with extra delays because of COVID and so forth. All those children were over 3 years old. So they are not in the end-line sample. There are other children in the end-line sample in that age bracket, but it led to a smaller sample just because not every household that was in the baseline still had or had a new young child in that group. So that, but the general effect still shows a significant increase, improvement, not increase, decrease of stunting, improvement in nutrition for those households who received the enhanced nutrition program and also received cash. Those who received enhanced nutrition program but did not receive cash did not do any better, statistically speaking, than the rest of the household. So there's a complementarity that shows up. That complementarity shows up only, as I said, with cash and not with the poultry transfer. But the core nutrition services did not affect stunting. Now, this is a bit of a problem because the enhanced nutrition services, although they did not necessarily, without the complementarity, they did not affect stunting, but they did affect the contact with the healthcare workers, and that was significantly large increase in the contact with healthcare workers. In addition, a very large increase of participation in nutrition training at the village savings programs. So they had a great deal of contact relative to the control in the services, but that was not enhanced by having cash. It was participating in enhanced nutrition, but not complementary with cash. The core nutrition program did have improvements in the training through the savings group, but not in the contact at home with the healthcare workers. So they had a modest increase of access to healthcare. That shows up, you'll see on these are the ones with the enhanced nutrition, this one here is with the core nutrition, and then there's in the core nutrition, there's cash has a impact. Both of these have an impact on the core nutrition, but it's smaller. It has to do with access to, this is based on a average standardized treatment effect. That is, there is a set of services that we're using, and this is the index of that set of services to account for multiple hypotheses. And so the larger impact is a balance of the village savings plus the household contact, but the village savings training programs do show up in the basic nutrition program. So what we see is also, we see small impacts on maternal diet diversity. In child diet diversity, it increased only with those households who had the enhanced nutrition, the nutrition contact, plus the poultry transfer. It was an aspect of the poultry transfer. But that still increased the access, the child diet diversity to a little less, even in the best case, less than 3 items out of 8. Breast milk is included in diversity for those children. That is very, very few children in this sample had what is considered an adequate diet diversity. And this is a bit of a challenge that has to be looked at further. And the nutrition services also, although they improved, there is a surprising question of where does the complementarity that we see in nutrition output, where does it come from? If it doesn't come from diet diversity, a little bit with poultry, but very little, and that's not with the cash, where does it come? It doesn't come with access to services. So this is a question that is remaining unanswered in this data set. But we do see, as a bottom line, that there seems to be a protective role that comes out with the cash transfer enhanced and the enhanced nutrition interacting in a time of what seems to be a declining nutritional status in the community. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I will be presenting the work we've done on the effectiveness of a light touch men's engagement component to change men's attitudes and behaviors in Ethiopia. So over the last decades, we've seen growing improvements in gender equity worldwide with increased girls' school enrollment and women's labor force participation. But one area where there's inequality that broadly persists is actually in the home. So even when both the husband and the wife are working, women still tend to perform a larger share of domestic tasks. And this can sort of be explained by social norms about gender roles explaining these imbalances. So only recently has the importance of addressing gender norms been acknowledged in poverty alleviation programs. But very few programs actually target gender norms as an explicit outcome. So what we do here is we investigate the impact on men's gender equitable attitudes and behaviors of SPIR, which Dan has already sort of explained the program quite well. But in the program, gender was mainstreamed throughout the SPIR programming. And it was sort of the main two components were, one, there was these trainings that were occurring on gender dialogues within the savings group component, so the savings groups and training component. And separately, there was also male engagement groups, which were specifically focused for men. So what we do in this paper is we take advantage of the 3 rounds of data and the timing of the men's engagement groups to try to identify the added impact of men's engagement groups on men's gender attitudes and behaviors. So just to give a little more detail on the actual components. So the gender trainings that were part of these savings groups were 6 sessions, each lasting about an hour. And there were 6 different domains that included workloads of men and women, cooperation and sharing household work, household decision-making, improved listening, communication, and understanding skills, engaging men in child care work, and identifying restricted norms related to women's mobility. So these, again, occurred in the savings groups. So it included about 20 to 25 men and women who were meeting approximately every 2 weeks, and the dialogue was facilitated by a community facilitator. The second component was the male engagement groups. This was a little bit more intense. It was 8 sessions lasting about 2 hours each, again on gender roles, power in early marriage, the father's legacy, so thinking about how men's fathers acted within the household, caregiving, the division of caregiving, and sort of understanding nutrition and the role men can play in the nutrition of their children. Again, so this was focused specifically for men. It was only men were invited, approximately 16 men in each group. And this time, these groups did include PSNP and non-PSNP households because there was really an effort in order to change norms. You sort of had to include everyone in your community, not just those targeted for the program. The groups met twice a month, and they were facilitated by trained male facilitators. So the timeline I'm going to bring up again because it is quite important for our identification. The gender sort of dialogue or trainings was part of L, the livelihoods components with the savings groups and training. That's where these gender dialogues occurred. So in the basic livelihoods model. The male engagement groups occurred here in the N star, and it occurred after the midline, okay? So that's a little bit, that's quite important for our identification. So in the midline analysis, what we're going to concentrate on is that all 3 treatment arms were receiving the gender training through the basic livelihood models with these saving groups and trainings, okay? So all 3 treatment arms were receiving the gender dialogue. So our main comparison is going to be across each of these treatment arms compared to the control arm who did not receive any sort of the gender dialogue through the savings group. At N line, only N star, so households in N star received male engagement groups. And this was rolled out after the midline. So our main comparison, the one that we're most interested in, is going to be the impact of T1 and T3, which received the male engagement, compared to T2, which did not receive the male engagement groups. Our outcomes that we look at are going to be summary indices, where we concentrate on men's involvement in domestic tasks. So it is a standardized index composed of 3 different indicators, 3 different questions we ask about this. And men's gender equitable attitudes, which is again a standardized index composed of 3 indicators. Okay, so these are the results for men's involvement in domestic chores or tasks. I graph sort of both the treatment effects at midline and at endline because our estimation sort of is different. And you can see that at midline, we see significant improvements across all 3 treatment arms of about 0.12 to 0.18 standard deviations. And the impacts are similar across all 3 treatment arms, which is what we would expect given that all 3 treatment arms at midline had received the gender dialogue. At endline, we see significant improvements across T1 and T3 of about 0.26 and 0.29 standard deviations. Again, these are the 2 treatment arms that receive the male engagement groups. The size of the impact of T1 and T3 is significantly different to that of T2. So there is some significant difference in these impacts. Now, also, if you try to compare across rounds, we see that especially for T1, the size of the impact at endline compared to midline is significantly larger. So these are the results for men's gender equitable attitudes, and they're quite similar to the previous results. So at midline, we see significant improvements in all 3 arms of about 0.08 to 0.09 standard deviations. Again, all 3 arms were receiving the gender dialogue at midline, had received the gender dialogue by midline. At endline, we see significant improvements in men's attitudes in T1 who received the male engagement, and very borderline significant or not for T3. But what's important here, again, is that the size of the impact across T1 and T3 is significantly different to that of T2, who did not receive the male engagement. Again, if we try to compare what's going on across rounds, for T2, the size of the impact is actually significantly smaller. So any improvements that T2 saw at midline have basically disappeared by endline. And again, T2 is the arm that did not receive the subsequent male engagement groups. So, to sum up, at midline, all treatment arms improved men's gender's equitable behaviors and attitudes, but the impacts were only sustained or improved at endline for the treatment arms that received the male engagement subsequently after midline. And the main difference, again, of the N-STAR is the male engagement groups. And so an overall general conclusion then is that this multifaceted graduation model of with gender components, we think can improve men's gender equitable attitudes and behaviors. But one thing we see is that without reinforcing interventions, so without interventions that are being reinforced, these improvements might not actually persist. Thank you.
Great. So we're to the last paper or a set of results focusing on depression and the treatment related to that. So in our study, one of the motivations for this is that depression really is one of these commonly experienced mental health disorders, with around 15% of people experiencing it over their lifetime. And prevalence rates tend to be about twice as high for women as compared to men. Depression is not just a disorder that's about feeling sad, but also has some debilitating somatic symptoms that are also characteristically there as well. So difficulty sleeping, eating, focusing on things, and other fatigue. And one of the challenges in these contexts, especially in low and middle income countries, is this large treatment gap. So one of the recent years, the Ministry of Health in Ethiopia reported that there was little over 100 practicing psychiatrists for a population of over 100 million people. So large treatment gaps, and then even larger when you kind of consider the conditions or services that might be available in more rural settings where we're working. And particularly relevant or important for us in this context, and in our context, the population we're working among, is this growing evidence of the bidirectional and potentially mutually reinforcing relationship between poverty and common mental health challenges. In this paper, we'll be focusing on depression. And some of the graduation model programming has been shown to have positive effects on mental health outcomes. There's some improvements in self-reported happiness or efficacy, but somewhat limited in terms of the measurements there. And really kind of the potential for directly targeting psychological or psychosocial well-being with treatment has the potential to have larger effects both on mental health outcomes as well as economic outcomes. And so this is really the motivation and the purpose and the focus of this component of our work. So mental health practitioners and others in the field have developed a number of different mental health interventions that have been tested in different contexts that can be delivered by non-specialists and are relatively scalable. And so one of these is interpersonal psychotherapy for groups that's been tested in different contexts, also a WHO-approved or recommended model that can be delivered both individually and in groups. And IPTG is an intervention that's targeted to address specifically grief, disputes, life changes, social isolation, and loneliness by identifying this relationship between depression and life problems and building those interpersonal skills to recover and manage problems. I'll share a little bit later in the presentation of the experience of a woman that was in one of these groups that will give you perhaps a little bit better idea of the impact that this had. But generally, this intervention was supported by colleagues at Johns Hopkins and Columbia Teachers College to support the training of supervisors and training of local facilitators that then facilitated these groups for women that were identified, as was already mentioned, at midline, and then enrolled in the groups. That's 12 weekly sessions that were conducted between January and March 2020. So just getting back and kind of reminding us of the study sample, the analysis here will focus on the subsample of women identified at midline that were experiencing depression and thus eligible for IPTG and were invited in T1 and T3 arms to participate in these group sessions. So moving to the results, we look at a number of different outcomes. The ones that I'll focus on here in this first slide are on depression. So at end line, which is nearly 1 year post-treatment or post the completion of these sessions, we find really no effects in T2 or T3. So T2, again, didn't receive the interpersonal psychotherapy in groups, but did receive the transfers among extremely poor households. But in T3, we didn't see these effects sustained. So we did have effects kind of from administrative reports that were there at the end of the sessions, but these don't seem to have persisted 1 year later in this T3 treatment. However, in T1, which combined both components of our program, the more intensive version of our program, we see this significant reduction of 12 percentage points from a control mean of 26% for women that had a probability of having 8 or higher on the PHQ-9. And then for a more restrictive dimension of depression, a kind of perhaps more clinically relevant measure of depression, major depressive disorder, that's built using an algorithm, kind of a more restrictive measure for depression, we still see a similar pattern of effects with no results or no effects in T2 and T3, but a positive and significant effect in T1, which is a 5.5% reduction over a control mean of 7.3%. So just as a reflection, this is kind of a drop of 50% for depression and even 75% for major depressive disorder. And these results are really driven by those women that are in extremely poor households that receive both the transfer and the group psychotherapy in T1. I won't have time to present all of our outcomes, but just to briefly mention, we did find some effects on psychosocial outcomes. So the first row here is on stress. So there's no statistically significant effect on stress, but however, in T1 there was a statistically significant difference between the effect in T1 as compared to T2 and T3 of reduction of stress, increase in happiness, again, a similar pattern of effects for T1, but not in T2 and T3, and no effects on self-efficacy. So I won't present them here, but there's some other outcomes that we also looked at, economic outcomes as well as nutritional outcomes. We saw some similar patterns of effects on economic outcomes, no kind of significant effects on consumption and assets, but some effects on income. But perhaps more notably on maternal nutrition, we did see, we didn't find effects on dietary diversity, but we found really strong and significant effects in T1 on women's nutrition as measured by BMI. So 0.4 standard deviation increase in BMI Z-scores for women in the T1 treatment arm. So just quickly, I wanted to share, this is some quotes from a woman who was 30 years old, went through the groups. She actually, to tell you a little bit about her story, her husband got really sick. They used all of their kind of assets to sell off their assets to pay for medication. He wasn't able to contribute to the economic components of their household, and these were just some of her reflections before and after the therapy. So she started to worry about my family, and I felt we were in a big problem. I couldn't do anything to solve my problem and change the situation. I started to experience some uncommon feelings. I was easily angry toward my children and husband, feeling tired without doing anything, crying every day, feeling helpless and hopeless, and feeling numb. I also lost my appetite and lost weight. And after the session, she mentioned that after I joined the group therapy, there were 7 more women struggling with depression like me, and we were supporting, listening, and encouraging each other. I felt like I found my best friends whom I can share my feelings, sadness, and personal problems. She also went on to explain of just how it also impacted her ability and kind of her energy levels and ability to engage with her family, as well as economic activities for her household. So just summing up in conclusion, the study is really the first to test this differential impact of adding a targeted mental health component to graduation programming. And in conclusion, we found that the components that just had the livelihood transfer didn't have a sustainable improvement for women who exhibited depression symptoms at midline. Similarly, with the same effects not seen with those that only received group psychotherapy. However, the results in T1 showed that the integrated intervention, including both livelihoods transfers for these extremely poor households and group therapy, had this effect on a number of outcomes, both in depression, contributing to higher happiness, as well as I mentioned earlier, in significant increases in maternal health. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. So that concludes our presentation portion of the seminar. And so now we'll shift over to the expert panel component. I want to ask Alamayu and Dean and Margot to please join us on the chairs up front. And I'll just briefly introduce them. Dean Carlin is Professor of Economics and Finance and Frederick Esser Nemmers Chair and Co-Director of the Global Poverty Research Lab at Northwestern University. He's also Chief Economist at the United States Agency for International Development. And Margot Vinez is Senior Economist in the Africa region at the World Bank, where her focus is on social protection and jobs. I'd introduced Alamayu, our colleague who also leads IFPRI's Ethiopia office. So I'm going to give over, we've done okay on time. We have a little more than half an hour left, so I'll give about half of that time for our panel discussion and then make sure we have time for sort of general discussion and Q&A after. Thanks. Alamayu, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. We have 20 minutes, so we move on without further ado. Thanks again, Dean and Margot, for joining us this morning. Let me start by giving you a brief opportunity to reflect on the presentations. 2 minutes, if we will, and then we proceed to specific questions. Let me start with Dan.
2 minutes, you said? Yes. Okay. I think I misunderstood. I thought we had closer to 5'10". Let me trim some then. So I think a lot these days, although I'm officially here under my university capacity, I do think a lot more these days about the process of evidence to policy for obvious reasons because of my other life. And papers don't live in silos. In a sense, research I think of as a mosaic. Each thing is a tile. And I think a lot, so then let me apply that here in a few different ways that I think, you have 6 papers here. You're really raising the bar to have this influence policy because they're speaking to each other, but yet they're not. And there's a lot of questions that I have that I think anybody would have the intersect. Some of them came up here, so let me rattle off a few. Harold, for instance, you talked about how the puzzle is where the complementarity is coming from. That's maybe the answers in the other papers. I mean, so like, I don't understand why, like I want to like bounce back and forth constantly when I was going through this. And you're making it really hard for the outside world to learn. And that's a shame because there's a lot of exciting stuff here that you're learning. So I'll highlight a couple things that I think are really exciting that I picked up in terms of results. One is a very useful graph, stunting, sadly getting worse, but yet the treatment effect showing big. That is like a great graph to use to motivate why counterfactuals are important. I plan to use that graph over and over again. So thank you. The results on males, in the 6 graduation studies that we put into Science, gosh, I'm now feeling very old, 9 years ago. We had this result where women's power got better at 2 years, and then fell to what I will refer to in a non-technical way as statistical never-ever land, where it was half of the treatment effect at 2 years at 3 years. So if someone said to us, do you find an effect at 3 years, we would say, well, relative to the control, we do not have statistically significant results at 3 years. If instead you said to me, do you find evidence of dissipation from 2 years, we'd say, no, we find no statistically significant difference between the positive 2-year result and the 3-year result. So you can choose whichever way you want to interpret that, okay? The point is, if you now ignore the standard errors and you just think about, like, there is something's going on that is falling back and why, and like, how do you deal with that? Would a reinforcement help? Like, and so that's, I was kind of excited to see that. Having said that, and this goes back to like, why are these being separated? The fact is, you're calling something enhanced nutrition that includes psychotherapy, that includes, gender roles and male chores and, male role, and those interplay. So, I mean, just to give you some like really crude examples, like if nutrition is improving stunting, which you find evidence it is, wouldn't that make you less depressed if your kids are healthier? I don't understand how you can separate those out and claim you have a test of, and that's going to be a delayed effect too. So the timing doesn't help you with there, because you don't like get enhanced nutritional stuff and like snap your fingers and stunting's down. 6 months later or however long later, you see your kids are healthier. That makes you feel better. You feel like you're making progress in life. So I just would treat that like a package and just treat it like it is, because that is what it is. And you're separating things out, and then you're losing both the richness of understanding the interaction, and you're also leaving people potentially very misled in terms of thinking that this was a psych treatment that can be teased apart. Right? Now, there's 6 other graduation studies that I know of that test psychological add-ons. So I don't know what, something you think you're identifying as unique here, but I would actually encourage you, I know we have this horrible incentive in academia to say everything's the first, but if everything's the first, then you can't, how do you compare stuff and like builds? And so like nothing's ever really the first. And so I want to know how this differs from the other 6 that I know of. And I'm willing to bet there's more than 6 others. I don't know the world, but I would just go straight to the AE registry. I know you can find the 6 on there because I did them and they're up there. But I guarantee you there's other people doing this too. And it would be great to understand how does this compare to those, because it goes back to that kind of mosaic point. Everything's You know, nothing lives in a silo. We want to be able to compare these things across. So then I'll leave you with one last thought, which is what the real comparison is here, that I think would be interesting and really useful. And this is the kind of, if I saw these, I think there's a lot of these interactions I think are interesting, but I think there's one tack that you can take that would be really fruitful, particularly from a policy perspective, which is, and it's a little bit like the Supreme Court line from Justice Potter, maybe, I forget which one, about pornography, and you know it when it's hard to define, you know it when you see it. I'm not sure what I would call this. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all. I mean, there's a lot of exciting components here, but it's somewhere in between, in USAID parlor, a traditional RIFSA and the kind of streamlined graduation model. And I would be really fascinated to understand a tighter comparison of the outputs that are going on here and the costs, to be able to compare it to those, because I think from a policy perspective, you actually have what might be a really nice contribution to understand what is the impact we can expect from the RIFSA model that was being done prior to graduation. And I think this might actually be closer to that in a sense. I don't know. I don't have a clear, but that's what a tight comparison would make. And again, it goes back to the, to like letting this be compared better to the other space for the components, but also for the full package. Because if it does speak to the other RIFSA model that was done previously, that would be really useful to be able to, you know, to understand what this is generating, how proximate it is to that versus the kind of more streamlined graduation lump sum. Sorry, I think I went long, so apologies.
Margot?
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It was really interesting to read the papers. So my thoughts come from two different perspectives. One, I worked on Ethiopia. I still work on the PSNP, on the livelihoods interventions. And I'm now working in the Sahel region, where we also have some really interesting experience on implementing graduation models through government systems. So my first reflection was, I think it would be really interesting in the paper and in general to reflect a bit more about why this is slightly different from the main PSNP model. This is PSNP implemented with additional support from NGOs. And what does it change exactly? So it means a very different delivery modality. Potentially it means higher fidelity of implementation, higher quality of implementation, which is great. And I think this is what gives you this amazing opportunity to generate more knowledge than we can on the main program, where obviously the capacity constraints are much, much higher, but also potentially means that the cost of the interventions will be much higher. So it would be really interesting to reflect on that. I know you're framing it as a light touch model, but it would be interesting to compare it to what's implemented elsewhere in Ethiopia, but and then more generally to understand better what the different components are, what, you know, what the training entail, and we can get back to that later, and how it's different from maybe different models of graduation. But in general, I think it's really interesting, and it's a great opportunity to experiment more than can be done at a bigger scale and within the constraints of the government program, and to generate lessons that can then be implemented and scaled through the general program. So it's really interesting to see that you took this opportunity seriously. I also found it really interesting, I know this is something we already shared with Jessica, that the cash and poultry arms had nearly identical effects on agricultural income. I think this is not something we've seen anywhere else. This is a question that comes up constantly in political discussions because policymakers love to do in-kind, they don't like to do cash. So I don't know, I just thought that was a really interesting contribution that maybe you can put forward, and it would be good to have a bit more details about these, you know, what happens and why we find the same effect in both groups, even though they potentially invest in slightly different types of livestock. The other parts of the findings that I find really interesting, and then I'm gonna stop, is the parts on the findings on savings groups and training separately from the cash transfer. I mean, this is a very light touch model, and I know a lot of countries are thinking about doing that. When you think about implementing these things at scales in safety nets that cover millions of people, it's very tempting to say, oh, let's just do this, you know, the very minimum component. So I think that's a very interesting aspect. I was also wondering how this interacts with the fact that you're basically only giving the transfers to the poorest households, which is what PSNP does in general in livelihoods, and how we can think about that. Obviously, it would have been really interesting to have heterogeneity, you know, depending on consumption at baseline, but I guess you were probably limited by the constraints of the program, but I don't know if there is anything that you can say on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I let our panelists say more because these are perhaps much more relevant to the conversation going on. We have about 4 questions, 2 for each, but I don't think we'll have time to go through them. Let me start with one question to Margot, which in part relates to what she already mentioned, and that is a lot of successful graduation models have ultimately led to households generating a broader or producing a broader portfolio of income-generating activities, going beyond both crop and livestock production. In the context of Ethiopia, however, rural, non-farm, non-agricultural income-generating opportunities are limited, and the research, the survey evidence also suggested that. What do these imply for poverty elevation? Please.
Thank you, Elima. I see it's a great question. It's also a very difficult one. And I just want to start by saying I think it's true that a lot of programs find large impacts on non-agricultural businesses. I don't know if it's all the if it's the case for all papers, but it's also I think interesting to note that in Ethiopia, livelihoods interventions have traditionally focused on livestock, and this has been true since the very beginning. I mean, livestock and agriculture, right? I mean, basically, when PSNP first started, it was linked to the other food security program, which was basically providing agricultural inputs on credit. Later, the household asset building program was developed, and it was still on the same model. When it finally merged with PSNP in PSNP 4, so you were basically at that stage, this was the very beginning of an attempt of the government to basically learn from the graduation pilot and try to diversify more towards other sources of income. I think it's very clear that it's a difficult switch to make in general, and I think the studies on aspirations, which were first done in Ethiopia, show that there are huge constraints also in terms of aspiration to do that switch. Yeah, I think it's a complicated issue. In PSNP 5, there has been a very deliberate attempt at trying to diversify more into other sources of income, and this was based partly on the results from other countries, but also on the rural income diagnostic, which suggested that there were opportunities to reduce poverty and increase income in rural areas by basically increasing productivity in agriculture was one of them. But the second huge pathway was increasing income enough from businesses. So this was, this drove very much a big change in the program, which I hope we're going to see results about. But that comes back to my first question. I was wondering to what extent. I know that other programs, for example, in the Sahel, are much more agnostic about the type of business that is being developed. The approach is much more entrepreneurial, about helping people think about what type of opportunities they have and helping them overcome some of the challenges they face in developing activities in those areas. But I think in your case, it seems to me that in this version, you're still pretty much on livestock, and I wonder to what extent, if you give money to someone and you give them a training about how to do livestock, of course they're going to do livestock. You kind of frame the choice of activity in a context where doing other activities is really hard. So I think it would be really interesting to understand better those results to have more detailed comparison about the content of the training, because I think the details actually matter. And I know that I'm not too keen on approaches where you do like big market assessments and a list of livelihood options to help people choose, but I think somewhere in between can possibly work. So I hope we're going to learn also from the experience in PSNP 5 in trying to move away from that approach.
Thank you, Margot. We are
I'm keen to know why. Because I was going to comment on that same thing about how it wasn't clear how that happened and whether it was. I wasn't clear whether that was happening here or not, but my understanding is it wasn't, and that in a lot of the other cases it does. So I'm keen, and it's not obvious to me which is better. I can see arguments both ways, so I'm keen to know why you think that's a bad idea.
What is a bad idea?
The kind of market assessment to say that, so that the training is focused saying, here's 4 enterprises, we vetted out, there's a value chain, it's bringing in outside capital, so it's, there's some export concept to it. What is it about that? Have you seen that fail, or why did you say that?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of examples where it failed. Because those market assessments are hard to make, and at the end of the day, I think the people who live there have more information than anyone external does. So I felt that, I'm not totally against it, but I think somewhere in between is good, where you kind of give, and that's what PSNP 5 tried to do. So you do some kind of market assessment, you give people options, these are potential options of farms that seem to work and seem to be, there are people who are successful with these options in your border. But then you still let them choose, and you still give them the tools to be able to assess whether this makes sense for them, as opposed to, saying this is either this package or this package. And then they're not fully part of the decision process.
And obviously, export opportunities are always an issue. So it seems that we have time for only one question, and that would be to Dean. Perhaps this will give you an opportunity to continue the intervention you had before. And that is, our research suggests that adding programming in nutrition, gender, male engagement, such as male engagement, mental health, has mixed but sometimes promising effects, including broadening the set of outcomes affected. How do you think about this evidence compared to evidence on the effects of large unconditional cash transfers without complementary interventions?
I'm not sure, because I need to see costs, is the simple answer, right? It's ultimately, we have seen the, unconditional cash transfers have, tremendous power of improving freedom, improving choice. It's an expanded version of kind of some of the things you were saying just then about livelihood choice, which is, but they don't do everything, right? The meta-analysis that we just recently put together, for instance, finds nothing remotely like the stunting results that you have here. There's a little bit of movement on anthropometrics, but nothing like that. Now, again, I'm using very hand-waving because I don't know the cost, but I think I can guess them, and they're not close to this, right? But that's ultimately the task at hand, is to ask for every dollar, which path does, can we do the most good? And because that way we can help, take the existing resources and do the most good we can with it. And that's, frankly, the name of the game. So I don't know the answer, but I want to know.
Thank you very much. So I hand over to Dan.
Yes, okay. So I want to invite the panelists, please. And we're just going to open it up with our remaining time. Thank you. So for just general Q&A and discussion. And so I'll start, Debalina, please. So we'll start in the room, but I'll make sure to get online as well. I'm fed some questions here from online. So if you could go to the microphone, please. If you want to ask a question, please go to the microphone if you're in the room. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, my question is directed to the male engagement part of the presentation. Really enjoyed that report. Thank you. So in some instances where, there are interventions trying to change norms, there are often sort of backlash to that idea, especially depending on how salient the norms around, in this case, I guess, norms around care work are what's being targeted. So depending on how salient that is to men's identity, how strictly enforced it is, and so on. So I was just curious if you, measured or had any measures around looking at conflict within the household potentially from some of this intervention. I remember Helena at RISE presented some findings around IPV, but I don't think that was tied to the mental health intervention. So, sorry, the male engagement intervention. So just curious if you noticed any of that. Thanks.
So let's take one more. John, do you want to go ahead? And
yeah, thank you. Yeah, John Meyer from USAID. I was curious about the point about financial inclusion, and I think first a comment. Your other effects, I guess you were calling them there, were you would call well-being outcomes. And financial inclusion seems more like a means to the end. So kind of a different category of effect. But then, I'd be very curious about what you mean by financial inclusion. I think the membership in a savings group, at least in my mind, wouldn't qualify. I mean, it's a good start, but some linkage with formal financial services, like PSNP was trying to do through MFIs or USACOs. And I think we found, I managed a different graduation program with FDF funds in the Highlands, and we found that the real transformational change came when people started making use of bigger loans from MFIs for kind of productive purposes. So I'm just talking, but the question might be about, the role of larger systems in bringing about the changes that we seek in this particular case, the financial sector, and whether that factors in. Thanks.
thanks, John. So let's take one more since you're here at the mic, and then we'll break there. I'll direct those questions to the team, and then I'll go online there's a couple of questions that have come in online that I'd like to also raise. Go ahead, please.
Great, thanks. Julie Ide with CRS. And I apologize if this question isn't specific to the study itself, but the broader context similar to sort of the wider systems question, especially given you mentioned, Almayo, in Ethiopia, the PSNP had components of public works and the importance of sort of landscape management and the power that social protection can have in sort of engaging communities and looking at their community assets and the impact that can have on nutrition, soil fertility, leading to productivity of the agriculture livelihoods, as well as potentially green businesses and things like that. Was there any consideration of including the public works component of the PSNP program in this study? Is there any way of looking at that? Or broadly, for those who are looking at graduation and social protection programs, is anyone looking at this public works aspect as it can relate to and support the graduation functions? Thanks.
Wonderful, thanks. Okay, so we have a question on the male engagement component. Melissa, why don't you go first? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Debelina, for that. So a short answer is we do have data on intimate partner violence. We didn't specifically look at intimate partner violence for this paper. We can think about adding it because we have the data, and we have looked at it for like the big reports that are always due to USAID. So we have looked at it. And the short answer is we don't really see any impacts at all on intimate partner violence, nor negative nor positive, of this program. We didn't put it in this specific paper. And one of the reasons, I don't know if this is a reason, but the outcomes we really did focus on for this paper were really men's attitudes, not women's attitudes, and men's, their sort of self-reports on domestic tasks. And so anyway, it is something to think about if we wanted to add. But thank you.
We find evidence that increases in IPV driven by drought are not observed for those households exposed to SPIR. So there's heterogeneity, but in the pooled sample, SPIR does not reduce intimate partner violence.
But it's not being driven by the mental health or gender or the male.
We don't find heterogeneity across arms in the protective effects of drought.
Okay,
want me to
next.
speak to financial inclusion?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's where I was going.
Okay.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks, John, for the question. So I agreed with your interpretation about the financial inclusion variables is more in the realm of mechanisms. The variables included are the probability of any savings, the amount of savings, the probability of any credit, formal credit, and the amount of credit. So membership in VESA is not included in that outcome family. Those large positive effects are overwhelmingly driven by savings. So the probability of any savings roughly doubles from a low base, and the level amount of savings roughly triples from a low base. So we're not talking about a huge nest egg, from $25 in the control arm to $75 on average. We did see at end line an increase in the probability of formal credit. So getting to your point about linking to the formal financial system only for transfer recipients. And that effect was large relative to a low base, but overall still only about 15% of transfer recipients are accessing formal credit at baseline. So it could potentially have very large effects for those households, but we wouldn't expect it to be a substantial effect detectable on the whole sample.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Harold.
Going to Dean's important point about trying to link between the studies, the subcomponents, it is plausible. It's plausible, but the design of the study didn't let us look at this, whether the access to the savings, even if it doesn't lead to the type of investments for microcredit usually does, precautionary savings. If we're dealing with a protective nature on the nutrition, that the precautionary savings could serve that role, and unfortunately our diet diversity doesn't give quantities of food, and we don't have everybody who gets the cash transfer also has access to the Savings Institute, so you can't put one more randomization within the already complex design, but it's quite plausible. Unfortunately, we can only go to plausible speculations and not a test.
You want to react to that, Dean? Or?
No, I was going to answer. I can wait. I wanted to say something on the third question.
No, go ahead.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've seen a systematic review of this kind of space, but I would say that what I have seen, and it shows that there's no link. That when you do those kinds of things you're describing, you kind of get exactly what you designed for, but that's it. So if you do a cash for work program, there's doing community stuff to like build a road or do something, then you get the thing that they said they were going to do. And there's no like, there were all these kind of grand hopes that it would like lead to greater downstream things, including amplification of impacts on things like this, and the evidence just is not there. Now, that's a little bit, I've not done a systematic review in the past few years, certainly not since I've started doing a lot more of these in my role, so maybe there's newer evidence, maybe there's some way of doing it. Maybe there's some counterexample. Is it something that couldn't benefit from, more analysis that maybe would make me update and say something different? That I want to leave that to be clear on the table. Like I don't want to be overclaiming, but that's my rough sense is that that's those programs do deliver an impact on exactly what they designed to do and nothing more.
May I add?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, as Adine suggested, it is rather difficult to assess the impact of these interventions. In fact, in the Ethiopian case, they have always been separated from the impact of the transfer and the public works themselves. But what because we have collected data along the lines of when and what was built and so on, we estimated a dynamic yield growth equation using the panel data, and we identified, obviously, all these identification challenges are there. With that, given that, we found that these soil and water conservation structures built through public works raise cereal yield by about 2.5 or so %. So there is some positive impact on yield, but as I said, again, the robustness of these results have to be further checked, although some of these unobservables are accounted for by this instrumentation of a dynamic yield equation. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Alamayu. So, Michael, I'd like to come to you. I've got a question, one of the questions online, but also just give you an opportunity to kind of react to any of this. I don't think I said at the top here when we had our agenda slides up. So, so Michael's chief of party of the project. He's based with World Vision and also a collaborator on a lot of the research that you see here. The question was whether, how did IPTG affect child nutrition or other child-level outcomes, which we had assessed kind of in the early days of that analysis. So you could pick up on that, but otherwise just react to any of what's been said. I actually, yeah, go ahead, and then I get the mic back, so I'll be good. Yeah.
Oh, do you want to?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, so really that was one of the motivations actually for the intervention as well, thinking about maternal depression as a kind of not only an outcome for women's own health, but the kind of secondary or kind of impact level on child nutrition and kind of thinking about the child care aspects and things that are affected by depression and other nutritional components at the household level. So we unfortunately didn't see any differential impacts in our work on child nutrition. We did have very small samples though, so we're talking about kind of people that screened in for depression that were eligible, and then among those women, there was very few women that had kind of a child of eligible age to look at kind of stunting effects. So we didn't have kind of a large study sample to explore that with more thoroughly. Maybe just to briefly comment on one of Dean's earlier interventions and comments on how this relates to and kind of can contribute to work being done elsewhere. I would just reflect on that there is a really rich kind of interest in this area and kind of intervention in different types of components, psychosocial, kind of from a light touch angle to kind of more intensive psychotherapy or CBT based. So our, I think, contribution is so far, there's a lot of design decisions on what, do you do this for the general population? Do you do it for a targeted group? Do you screen in people with certain, level of stress or anxiety or depression and focus treatment on them? Is there a larger benefit that can be had? So there's work that's been done in Ghana showing a CBT intervention that can be, or has shown to be beneficial for kind of as a non-targeted support for people that are in these contexts, recognizing that they're probably facing a number of challenges that would benefit from a mental health intervention. There's a more recent work being done in Uganda with the midline results that are out with a report from IPA that actually showed a similar, actually identical intervention, IPTG, that was implemented there for a larger group, not a targeted group, and they saw actually negative impacts from that. So kind of potentially stigmatizing, or kind of they read into kind of interpreting why that might have been the case, but there's actually negative outcomes associated with kind of a broader targeting or bringing both depressed and non-depressed people into these groups. So yeah, I think there's a lot of questions around design for these interventions, how they can be successfully brought in to these programs, and what kind of questions around the level of the intervention that can be scaled, the intensity, and kind of can you get still effects with a smaller program? So there's kind of a broad range of design questions that are really active right now in this space.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And with that, we're a few minutes over, so we will end here. I want to thank everybody, all of the presenters, and thank Dean and Margot and Alamayu as well. Yeah, and I'll just close by saying, for those here in the room, we have lunch provided right now outside, and some nice Ethiopian coffee for you. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.